Elias Thorne did not look at the Manhattan skyline and see glass, steel, or the hubris of billionaires. He saw tension. He saw load-bearing vectors, wind shear tolerances, and the invisible mathematical poetry that kept 10 million tons of concrete from plummeting into the island's ancient bedrock. To Elias, a building was not a structure. It was a living, breathing organism, and the blueprints were its DNA. And right now, looking at the glowing monitors in his darkened Midtown office, Elias was staring at a genetic mutation. Outside the window, a torrential October rain lashed against the glass, blurring the neon bleed of Times Square into impressionistic streaks of crimson and electric blue. The rhythmic thrum of the storm was a white noise backdrop to the hum of Elias's workstation, a custom-rigged server bank capable of rendering millions of geometric data points in real time. On the primary ultra-wide display rotated a three-dimensional wireframe model of the city's newest, most fiercely guarded architectural triumph, the Selim. Designed by the enigmatic starchitect Julian Vance, the Selim was a 104-story twisting spire of black glass and anodized titanium. It was billed as the smartest building in the world, a vertical city where every lumen of light, every breath of conditioned air, and every drop of water was algorithmically optimized. Elias's firm had been contracted to perform the final digital volumetric audit before the certificate of occupancy was issued. It was supposed to be a routine sign-off, a rubber stamp, but the math was bleeding. Elias leaned forward, the blue light of the monitor washing over his pale, angular face. His eyes, shadowed by days of sleep deprivation, darted across the cascading lines of telemetry on his secondary screen. He tapped a sequence of keys, stripping away the building's gleaming digital skin to reveal its skeletal structure. The high-tensile steel core, the sprawling circulatory system of MEP, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, and the rigid grid of floor plates. Run the variance algorithm again, Elias muttered to the empty room. His voice was a dry rasp. He initiated the script. The computer cross-referenced the gross structural envelope against the net internal volume. The progress bar crawled, rendering the sheer mass of the skyscraper in a point cloud tessellation of green light. Then the system chimed. A soft, surgical ping. Discrepancy detected. Volume delta. -500 square feet. Elias blinked, pulling his wire-rimmed glasses off to rub the gritty fatigue from his eyes. He put them back on. The number hadn't changed. 500 square feet. Unaccounted for. In the sprawling suburbs of the Midwest, 500 square feet was a two-car garage. In the cutthroat, hyperdense geometry of Manhattan real estate, it was a king's ransom. At the Selim's projected market rate, that much space was worth upwards of $15 million over a standard leasing life cycle. It was the size of a luxury studio apartment simply gone, swallowed by the digital ether. Elias's fingers flew across the keyboard, isolating the anomaly. He sliced the holographic model horizontally, scrolling up through the floors like a god examining the strata of a canyon. Floor 10. Floor 20. Floor 35. At floor 42, the model snagged. He zoomed in, expanding the wireframe until the lines of the 42nd floor filled his vision. The floor was designated as an interstitial mechanical level, a space reserved for heavy HVAC units, elevator overruns, and water filtration banks. It was a floor devoid of human habitation, accessible only by the engineering staff. Elias overlaid the mechanical schematics atop the structural grid. The green lines of the floor plate intersected with the red lines of the ventilation ducts and the blue lines of the plumbing mains. But right in the center, wedged between the high-rise elevator bank and the primary structural shear wall, was a void. It wasn't an empty room. An empty room would have doors, ventilation, and a designation on the ledger. This was a blind spot, a perfect, rectangular prism measuring exactly 20 by 25 feet, sealed behind 2 feet of reinforced concrete on all 6 sides. No doors. No windows. No vents. What are you looking at, Thorne? Elias flinched, his hand jerking on the mouse. Maya Lin stood in the doorway of his office, illuminated by the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor behind her. She wore a sleek, rain-spotted trench coat, and held 2 steaming cardboard cups from the halal cart down the street. Her dark hair was plastered to her cheeks, but her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. As the senior systems engineer for the auditing firm, Maya was the pragmatic anchor to Elias's theoretical obsessions. "You're supposed to be in Brooklyn," Elias said, his heart still hammering against his ribs. "And you were supposed to upload the Selim audit to the client servers 3 hours ago," Maya replied, stepping into the dim office and kicking the door shut behind her. She set one of the cups on his desk, the scent of bitter espresso and cardamom cutting through the sterile, recycled air of the room. "Vance's people are breathing down my neck. Julian Vance does not like to wait." "Vance can wait," Elias said, not taking his eyes off the screen. "I found a ghost." Maya sighed, shedding her damp coat and draping it over the back of a leather chair. She walked up behind him, leaning over his shoulder. She smelled of rain and cold city wind. "A ghost? Elias, please tell me you haven't spent the last 12 hours chasing a rounding error in the structural loads. We just need to certify the gross square footage." "It's not a rounding error," Elias said. He tapped the glass of the monitor with the tip of his pen, pointing to the dark, empty rectangle on floor 42. "Look at this. Mechanical floor."
Zunsi.
"What do you see?" Maya squinted at the glowing wireframe. "I see a structural dampener housing. Or an elevator chase." "Wrong," Elias said, his voice tightening with a sudden electric thrill. He clicked his mouse, layering the elevator schematics into the model. The yellow shafts of the elevators appeared, bypassing the void entirely. The local cars terminate at floor 40. The express cars bypass 42 entirely. It's not an elevator chase. Maya frowned, leaning closer. "Okay, then it's an exhaust plenum. A return airdrop." Elias smiled, a thin, humorless expression. "That was my second thought." He clicked another button. The HVAC schematics flared in bright crimson. Maya inhaled sharply. The massive arterial ducts of the ventilation system did not pass through the void. Instead, they bent around it. The primary air return, a pipe wide enough for a man to crawl through, took a mathematically illogical 45-degree detour to avoid the 20 by 25-foot space, costing thousands of dollars in extra sheet metal and creating unnecessary airflow resistance. "The plumbing does the same thing," Elias whispered, layering the blue pipes onto the screen. They, too, bowed outward, hugging the perimeter of the empty space like a river flowing around a boulder. "Maya, look at the geometry. This isn't a rendering artifact. This isn't a mistake. The mechanical systems were deliberately engineered to conceal this volume." Maya stood silently for a long moment, the glow of the screen reflecting in her dark eyes. 500 square feet, she murmured. "Exactly. Encased in structural concrete. No access points. None on the blueprints," Elias corrected. Maya shook her head, taking a step back as if the monitor had suddenly become radioactive. "Elias, this is Julian Vance we're talking about. The man is a fanatic. He fired his lead interior designer on the Vanguard project because the marble veins in the lobby didn't align with true north. He doesn't make mistakes, and he certainly doesn't leave 500 square feet of dead space in the core of his crown jewel." "I know," Elias said softly. He spun his chair around to face her. "That's what terrifies me. If Julian Vance built a sealed, hidden room in the center of a billion-dollar skyscraper, he did it for a reason. And he went to extraordinary lengths to keep it off the official Department of Buildings filings." "Which means it's illegal," Maya said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If there's an unaccounted void, the structural integrity models we submitted to the city are compromised. The fire suppression calculations are wrong. We can't sign off on this, Elias. If that space exists, the Selim is a liability." "I can't prove it exists," Elias said, turning back to the screen. The dark rectangle seemed to pulse in the center of the wireframe, a black hole exerting a massive gravitational pull on his mind. "A digital blueprint is just a promise. To know if he actually built it, I'd have to see it."
"No."
Maya's tone was absolute. "Absolutely not. We flag the anomaly in the report, we send it to Vance's firm, and we let them explain it. We do not go snooping around an active, highly secure construction site in the middle of the night. The building opens in 3 weeks, Maya. Once the security grid is fully autonomous, no one without a Vance Corporation biometric pass will even be able to access the lobby, let alone the mechanical floors. Elias stood up, his tall, thin frame casting a long shadow across the office. He reached for his wool coat hanging on the coat rack. Elias, stop, Maya warned. Julian Vance is not just an architect. He's a billionaire with private security that makes the NYPD look like mall cops. If you trespass in the Sealam, you're not just risking our contract. You're risking your career, your freedom. Elias paused, his hand gripping the rough wool of his collar. He looked at Maya, seeing the genuine concern in her eyes. She was right. The logical, rational thing to do was to file the paperwork and go home to sleep. But Elias's mind didn't work like that. He saw the world in perfect, unbroken lines. A puzzle missing a piece was an itch beneath his skin, a cognitive dissonance that would slowly drive him mad. 500 square feet of absolute nothingness, suspended 400 feet above the streets of Manhattan. What was inside? A vault? A structural flaw? Or something else entirely? The city outside howled, the wind driving the rain hard against the glass, begging to be let in. I just need to see the concrete, Elias said, his voice barely audible over the storm. I just need to tap the wall. If it sounds hollow, I'll know. He pulled the coat over his shoulders and walked past her, leaving the coffee untouched on his desk. On the monitors behind him, the digital skeleton of the Sealam continued to rotate in the dark, keeping its secrets buried in the geometry of the impossible. The Vance Spire's primary cooling node didn't just hum. It breathed. It was a mechanical leviathan of brushed steel and frosted condensation pipes, buried 80 stories beneath the glittering Manhattan skyline. Down here in the subterranean dark, the air was sharp with the metallic tang of ozone and the chemical bite of chilled freon. Maya Lin clung to the shadows of the catwalk, her pulse synchronizing with the rhythmic, deafening throb of the industrial turbines. She wiped a bead of sweat from her brow, a stark contrast to the freezing ambient temperature of the sub-basement. Her breath plumed in the blue emergency lighting as she stared down at the isolated server terminal, the architectural nerve center of Julian Vance's architectural empire. 3 minutes, she told herself. That was the exact window between the automated security sweeps. She dropped from the catwalk, her boots hitting the grated floor with a soft, practiced thud. Maya moved with the fluid economy of someone who had spent her life slipping through the cracks of the city's infrastructure. Reaching the terminal, she pulled a sleek, obsidian drive from her jacket and jammed it into the auxiliary port. Her fingers flew across the holographic keyboard, bypassing the superficial firewalls with a brute force algorithm she and Elias had cooked up the night before. The screen flared crimson, then yielded to a cool, compliant green. Come on, Julian, Maya whispered to the empty, freezing room. Show me what you're hiding in the lungs of this monstrosity. A progress bar materialized, inching forward with agonizing slowness. Asterisco coping. Classified back schematics, sector 4. Maya's eyes darted to the heavy blast doors at the far end of the corridor. Julian Vance didn't employ standard security guards. He used ex-military contractors who patrolled with the silent precision of predatory cats. Vance was a man obsessed with perfection, a billionaire architect who viewed the city not as a habitat, but as a circuit board. Every wire, every duct, every soul had its designated path. But Maya had found a glitch in his perfect design. The impossible void they had discovered in the blueprints last week. A massive, unaccounted-for volume of space right in the core of the spire. 90%. The heavy clack of a magnetic lock echoing from the corridor froze the blood in her veins. The sweep was early. Asterisk 98%. 100. Asterisk. Maya snatched the drive, severing the connection just as the heavy blast doors began to slide apart. She didn't wait to see the sweep beams of their tactical rifles. She launched herself over the terminal, sliding across the frost-slicked floor and diving into the cavernous intake manifold of the secondary ventilation shaft just as the guards rounded the corner. The intake fan was mercifully dormant, scheduled for maintenance. Maya scrambled up the curved, galvanized steel of the duct, her muscles burning, the darkness swallowing her whole. She didn't stop climbing until the shouts of the guards were drowned out by the distant roar of the city above. The rain was lashing against the slanted skylights of Elias Thorne's Dumbo loft when Maya finally kicked the heavy iron door shut behind her. She was soaked to the bone, smelling of rust and damp concrete, but her eyes were entirely alight. Elias was waiting by the central drafting table, a half-empty glass of amber scotch resting perilously close to a stack of ancient, hand-drawn floor plans. The older architect looked like a relic of a bygone era, with his silver-streaked beard and a tweed waistcoat dusted with graphite. He had been Vance's mentor decades ago, before Vance's ambition had eclipsed his morality, leaving Elias discarded in the wake of his meteoric rise. "You're late," Elias said, his voice a gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He didn't look up from his reading glasses. "Julian's guard dogs are getting faster," Maya replied, tossing her wet leather jacket over a chair. She held up the obsidian drive, its LED indicator pulsing like a captured heartbeat. "But I got it. The complete ventilation layout for the spire, unredacted." Elias finally looked up, a flicker of genuine apprehension crossing his weathered face. "Plug it into the holodable. Let's see what madness my former protege has been drafting." Maya slotted the drive into the central console of the massive, glass-top table dominating the room. The loft plunged into darkness for a fraction of a second before the table roared to life, projecting a stunning, three-dimensional wireframe of the Vance spire into the air between them. It was a cathedral of light, soaring 80 stories high, rendered in glowing sapphire lines. With a swipe of her hand, Maya stripped away the facade, the structural steel, the electrical grids, and the plumbing, leaving only the HVAC system. The glowing blue model shifted into a complex circulatory system of ducts, plenums, and exhaust vents. Elias stood up slowly, bringing his scotch glass with him. He squinted at the floating projection, walking a slow circle around the table. For a long time, the only sound in the loft was the staccato drumming of the rain. "This is wrong," Elias murmured, his brow furrowing deep. "Maya, look at the CFM ratings on these central conduits." Maya leaned in, tapping a section of the glowing projection. "Cubic feet per minute. Wait, that can't be right." "It's not," Elias said, pointing the rim of his glass at the massive vertical shafts running parallel to the elevator banks. "These primary return ducts are scaled at 22 feet in diameter. You could fly a commercial drone through them. The airflow required to pressurize a space that large would create a vacuum strong enough to suck the windows out of their frames. It's an engineering absurdity." "Unless," Maya said, her mind racing, tracing the lines of the massive, oversized vents. "They aren't meant for air." Elias frowned. "Then what are they for? Routing cables? You don't need a 20-foot diameter for fiber optics." Maya didn't answer immediately. She walked over to her duffel bag and pulled out a damp, crumpled manila folder. "While I was waiting for the heat to die down in the sub-basement, I was thinking about Vance's upcoming Vanguard Gala. The one he's hosting this weekend to unveil the Spire's penthouse levels. A gathering of the worst vultures in global finance and politics," Elias scoffed. "What does a high society party have to do with anomalous ductwork?" "Everything," Maya said. She extracted a flash drive from the folder and plugged it into a secondary port on the table. "I didn't just steal the blueprints tonight. Earlier this week, I skimmed the Vanguard Gala's encrypted VIP guest list. Vance is obsessed with flow, Elias. You told me that yourself. He hates congestion. He hates the idea of the elite mingling with the pedestrian traffic of the city." She typed furiously on the console. "Vance's guests aren't arriving by limousine or helicopter. They're too paranoid for that. Too high profile. So I ran a spatial correlation. I overlaid the VIP drop-off coordinates with the blueprints. Maya hit the execute key. Instantly, a swarm of crimson data points materialized within the sapphire wireframe of the building. Each red dot represented a high-profile guest. A tech oligarch, a foreign dignitary, a media baron. Elias gasped softly, the scotch sloshing over the rim of his glass to stain the floor. The crimson dots didn't map to the lobbies. They didn't map to the helipads. Every single guest coordinate corresponded perfectly to a reinforced access hatch within the anomalous ventilation system. The red dots formed a flawless, subterranean network, shooting up through the massive 22-foot shafts in a synchronized ballet of movement. "My God," Elias whispered, removing his glasses. "It's a transit system, a localized maglev or pneumatic network, built directly into the core of the building," Maya finished, her voice laced with awe and dread. "Invisible to the public, invisible to city planners. A completely private, high-speed arterial network for the elite. They bypass the city entirely. They enter through subterranean municipal nodes, get loaded into transport pods, and shoot straight up the spine of the spire." She reached out and pinched the holographic projection, zooming in on the apex of the building where all the massive conduits converged. The crimson transit lines all terminated in the exact center of the building, the very place that, on all public architectural filings, was supposed to be a solid block of reinforced concrete to stabilize the tower's sway. "The impossible void," Elias said, his voice barely above a breath. "It's not a void," Maya corrected, staring into the glowing red epicenter of the hologram. "It's a grand station, a private terminus for the most powerful people in the world, hidden inside a blind spot of the city's architecture." The sheer scale of Julian Vance's arrogance settled over the room, heavy and suffocating. He hadn't just built a skyscraper. He had built a sovereign state within the walls of Manhattan, complete with its own hidden infrastructure. Maya looked at Elias, the blue and red light reflecting in her dark eyes. The thrill of the heist was gone, replaced by the chilling realization of what they had stumbled into. If Julian Vance is secretly routing the global elite into a hidden fortress in the middle of New York, Maya said, her tone dead serious, then the Vanguard Gala isn't just a penthouse unveiling. Elias set his glass down on the table, his eyes locked on the glowing, impossible station. "No," the old architect agreed grimly. "It's a staging ground, and we have exactly 3 days to find out what he's planning to unleash when those doors lock." The rain fell in sheets of liquid obsidian, slicing through the neon-drenched night of the city. It hammered against the glass curtain wall of the Aetherius Corporation's flagship tower, a 60-story monolith that stabbed into the bruised underbelly of the storm clouds. Standing in the shadow of a monolithic concrete planter at the edge of the plaza, Elias Thorne wiped a slick of freezing water from his eyes. His rented tuxedo clung to his frame, the soaked wool heavy and smelling faintly of damp earth and ozone. "The fenestration on the lower levels is entirely seamless," Elias muttered, his teeth chattering as he stared up at the glowing fortress. "If we miss the window during the shift change, the biometric locks reset. We'll be locked out in the cold, or worse, locked in the holding cells." Beside him, Maya Lin crouched beneath the meager overhang of a brutalist sculpture. She held a waterproof datapad shielded against her chest, the pale blue light of the screen illuminating the sharp, determined angles of her face. She was dressed in a sleek, midnight blue evening gown that somehow managed to look tactical. "We won't miss the window," Maya said, her voice a steady thrum that cut through the noise of the deluge. "The phantom blueprints don't lie, Elias. The anomaly we found in the ventilation schematics perfectly aligns with the spatial void on the gala level. The unmapped elevator is there. We just have to walk right through the front door to find it." "Walk right through," Julian Vance repeated, stepping out from the shadows. Unlike Elias and Maya, Julian looked entirely unbothered by the torrential downpour. His tailored charcoal suit shed the water as if by sheer force of his aristocratic will, and a wry, reckless smile played on his lips. "That is precisely why you brought me. You two are brilliant at reading the bones of a building, but you have no idea how the blood flows through it. Leave the circulation to me." Julian produced 3 glossy, gold foil invitations from his breast pocket, perfectly forged, courtesy of Maya's late-night coding and his own extensive network of underground contacts. "Shall we?" They moved out of the rain and into the blinding, crystalline glare of the Aetherius Tower's grand lobby. The transition from the violent, freezing storm to the suffocatingly opulent warmth of the gala was jarring. The air inside smelled of expensive vanilla orchids, roasting wagyu, and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. A string quartet played a frantic Vivaldi piece from a cantilevered mezzanine that hovered above the main floor, suspended by tension cables that Elias immediately noted were oversized for the structural load. A velvet rope labyrinth guided the city's elite through a gauntlet of security. Julian took the lead, handing over the invitations with a practiced, arrogant flick of his wrist. The heavily armed guards, dressed in immaculate white suits, scanned the barcodes. The machine chimed a pleasant green. Julian offered a devastating smile, hooked his arms through Elias and Maya's, and swept them into the belly of the beast. Once inside the grand ballroom, the sheer scale of the space was dizzying. Massive, fluted columns of white marble rose 50 feet to a vaulted ceiling frescoed with corporate mythology. But Elias wasn't looking at the art. His eyes tracked the subtle geometry of the room. He was looking for the blind spots. "Standard panopticon layout," Elias murmured, lifting a glass of champagne from a passing silver tray to blend in. He leaned closer to Maya, pitching his voice below the swell of the cellos. "Security cameras are nested in the ornate molding above the chandeliers. They have a sweeping intersection of 90 degrees. But look at the structural columns." Maya's eyes darted across the room, analyzing the spatial flow. "The columns are too wide," she whispered back, her fingers tapping a silent rhythm against her champagne flute. "They're decorative, not just load-bearing. Aetherius retrofitted this ballroom 5 years ago. They kept the old classical columns but widened them with plaster to hide the HVAC routing we saw in the blueprints. Creates a wedge of dead space, a shadow in the surveillance net." "Exactly," Elias said, a thrill of adrenaline piercing his damp chill. "If we move tangentially to the columns, staying within the 6-foot acoustic shadow cast by the string quartet's mezzanine, we drop off the monitors completely." Julian, who was casually charmed a pair of socialites near the caviar station, drifted back to them. "I've mapped the guard patrols. 3 men on the floor, rotating clockwise. They move like clockwork, which is their fatal flaw. They aren't watching the people. They're watching the space. I need to change the shape of the space." "How?" Maya asked. Julian's smile sharpened. "Architecture is just the manipulation of movement. Watch." Julian strolled toward the center of the room, positioning himself near a massive, towering pyramid of champagne glasses that sat on a rolling mahogany table. With a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of his hip, he bumped the corner of the table. It rolled precisely 2 feet to the left before locking into the plush carpet. It was a tiny alteration, but in the strict choreography of the gala, it was a tectonic shift. A cluster of wealthy guests, forced to navigate around the newly positioned table, bottlenecked into the main circulation path. The flow of bodies clogged. The rotating security guards, suddenly faced with an impenetrable wall of silk and tuxedos, instinctively paused, craning their necks and breaking their rigid patrol lines to assess the crowd. "Sight lines are broken," Maya hissed, her hand gripping Elias's forearm. "Camera sweep in 3, 2, 1. Go." Elias and Maya slipped away from the light. They moved with absolute precision, trusting the theoretical geometry over their own instincts. They walked briskly into the sweeping shadow of the nearest marble column, staying tight to the cold plaster. Just as Elias calculated, they were completely swallowed by the architectural blind spot. No cameras could see through the massive pillar, and the guards were entirely focused on Julian's manufactured bottleneck. They pressed their backs against the smooth wall, edging along the perimeter of the ballroom toward the restricted service corridor. The roar of the gala faded into a muffled, aquatic hum as they slipped behind a heavy velvet curtain meant to obscure a catering prep area. They were in the interstitial space now, the hidden veins of the building. The air here was colder, smelling of industrial cleaner and raw concrete. Fluorescent lights buzzed angrily overhead. Blueprint says the unmapped void is 40 paces north, just past the secondary electrical room, Maya whispered, pulling out her datapad. The screen cast a ghostly pallor over her features. They moved swiftly down the stark white corridor. Suddenly, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed from the far end of the hall. A guard was approaching. Panic flared in Elias's chest, but his mind instantly reverted to the structural logic of the tower. He looked around wildly. The walls were flush, offering no doorways. But Elias remembered Chapter 2 of his advanced structural engineering textbook, Aesthetics over Function. Here, Elias breathed, grabbing Maya by the waist and pulling her toward what looked like a solid wall. The blueprints showed a recessed structural fin to support the load of the cantilevered floor above. They drywalled over it to make the hallway look straight, but the gap is still there. He pressed his fingers against the seam of a decorative wooden panel. It gave way with a soft click, a maintenance access hatch. They squeezed into the dark, suffocatingly tight alcove just as the guard rounded the corner. Elias held his breath, his chest pressed flush against Maya's. The smell of her damp hair and the metallic ozone of her datapad filled his senses. Through the louvers of the access panel, he watched the guard's shadow stretch across the floor, linger for a terrifying, heart-stopping second, and then recede as the heavy footsteps continued down the hall. Maya let out a ragged exhale. Too close. We're here, Elias said, pushing the panel open and stepping back into the corridor. They stood before a dead end. A solid wall of polished gray granite, completely unmarked.
No Anglis, no Keipads, no Seans.
To anyone else, it was the structural core of the Aetherius Tower. But Elias and Maya weren't just anyone. Maya stepped forward, closing her eyes. She pressed her knuckles against the cold stone and tapped. Click, click. She moved 2 feet to the right. Click, click. She moved another 2 feet. Thud, thud. The sound was hollow, resonant. It's a false partition, Maya said, her eyes snapping open, blazing with triumph. The exterior dimensions of this corridor measure 20 feet, but the interior volume is only 15. The phantom blueprints were right. There's a 5-foot void right behind this stone. Elias ran his hands along the microscopic grout lines of the granite. His fingers found a slight temperature differential, a line of stone that was a fraction of a degree warmer than the rest. The heat of a hidden electrical current. He pressed hard against the warm stone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a deep, pneumatic hiss that sounded like a sleeping beast exhaling, the solid granite wall fractured down the middle. The two have slid silently apart, revealing a yawning chasm of absolute darkness. The smell of old grease, rusted iron, and stale, trapped air poured out of the void. Inside, the dim emergency lights flickered to life, revealing the rusted, cross-braced interior of an industrial service elevator. It had no buttons, no floor indicators, only a single lever pointing down. Elias looked at Maya, the adrenaline humming in his veins, singing a song of pure architectural heresy. They had found the blind spot in the world. Going down, Elias said, and together, they stepped into the abyss. The air inside the interstitial void tasted of pulverized concrete, oxidized iron, and the cold, metallic tang of ozone. It was a dead space, a structural anomaly sandwiched between the 74th and 75th floors of the Ethelgard Tower. According to the public schematics filed with the city's planning commission, this area did not exist. According to the official blueprints Julian Vance had signed off on 5 years ago, the ceiling of the executive suites below mated seamlessly with the subflooring of the penthouse above. Yet here they were, crawling through a 3-foot-high labyrinth of shadows and steel. Elias Thorne led the way, his elbows scraping against the rough, fire-retardant coating of the I-beams. Every breath he drew was shallow, restricted by the suffocating tightness of the corridor. The beam of his penlight cut through the absolute blackness, illuminating a dense nervous system of fiber-optic cables, high-voltage conduits, and matte black ventilation shafts. It was an ecosystem of deceit, perfectly engineered and completely invisible to the thousands of people working in the illuminated world just inches beyond the drywall. "Watch the primary load bearer to your left," Elias whispered, his voice barely carrying over the low, omnipresent hum of the tower's HVAC system. "There's a sharp flange. Don't tear your suits." Behind him, Maya Lin let out a soft, rhythmic exhale as she slithered over a bundle of insulated wiring. Even in the crushing dark, she moved with a feline grace, her tactical harness shifting silently. The soft green glow of her wrist-mounted diagnostic terminal cast a sickly pallor over her features, highlighting the smear of grease across her cheekbone. "Structural integrity here is heavily reinforced," she murmured, tapping a sequence onto her screen. "Titanium bracing, acoustic dampening foam. They didn't just build a crawlspace, Elias. They built a soundproof highway." "I signed the permits," came Julian's voice from the rear. He sounded breathless, teetering on the edge of a panic attack. The brilliant, typically immaculate architect was covered in decades of undisturbed dust, his bespoke suit ruined, his worldview entirely shattered. "I swear to God, Elias, the CAD files, the physical models. None of this was there. The interstitial gap was supposed to be 6 inches for standard cabling. This is a 3-foot clearance. It's an entirely parallel floor." "The phantom blueprints," Elias said grimly, pausing to wipe a bead of sweat from his stinging eyes. "I told you, Julian. The firm that subcontracted the interior framing, they altered the geometry after the inspectors walked through. They've been doing it all over the city." "But why?" Julian gasped, his boots scraping clumsily against the steel grate below them. "To what end? The cost overrun alone to hide thousands of square feet of raw architecture." "We're about to find out," Maya interrupted, her tone suddenly dropping an octave. "Hold. Movement." Elias froze, pressing his chest flat against the cold steel. The Ethelgard Tower swayed gently in the high-altitude winds, a monolithic pendulum groaning against the storm outside. The rain they had escaped in the lower labyrinth was still hammering against the glass facade, a muffled, percussive roar that vibrated through the girders. Maya shimmied forward, pulling a flexible, fiber-optic snake camera from her hip pouch. "There's an access grate 10 yards ahead," she whispered, pointing to a faint, rectangular outline where the ambient darkness seemed slightly diluted by a pale, unnatural light. "Thermal imaging shows a massive heat bloom directly below it. Someone is in the office." Elias nodded, gesturing for utter silence. The 3 of them moved with agonizing slowness, inching their way toward the grate. The architecture around them seemed to compress, the acoustic foam swallowing the sound of their breathing, making the silence feel heavy, almost liquid. When they reached the grate, Elias positioned himself on the left, Maya on the right. Julian hovered behind them, his face pale and slick with terrified sweat. Maya threaded the microscopic lens of the snake cam through the louvered slots of the vent, syncing the feed to her wrist monitor. She tilted the screen so Elias and Julian could see. The camera looked down into the apex of corporate luxury. It was the corner office of Arthur Sterling, CEO of Vanguard Logistics, a man currently engaged in a hostile, highly publicized takeover of the very conglomerate that owned the Ethelgard Tower. Sterling sat alone at an expansive mahogany desk, his back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Beyond the glass, the storm raged, lightning fracturing the bruised New York sky, throwing jagged, strobing shadows across the plush carpet. Sterling was rubbing his temples, a half-empty glass of amber liquid sitting next to a glowing tablet. He looked exhausted, completely unaware that 3 pairs of eyes were watching him from the ceiling. "Sterling," Julian breathed, his eyes widening. "He's Vanguard's head. Why is he in a building owned by his competitors?" "Neutral ground," Elias murmured, his eyes locked on the screen. "A late-night negotiation. Or a trap." "Look at the western wall," Maya whispered sharply, tapping the edge of her screen. "The wood paneling. It's reading room temperature, but the thermal signature behind it is dropping rapidly. Someone is venting liquid nitrogen or a localized coolant." Elias squinted at the live feed, The western wall of Sterling's office was clad in seamless, ribbed mahogany. It looked completely solid, an architectural triumph of unbroken lines. But as they watched, the lines began to shift. It was mesmerizing in its horror. A section of the wall, nearly 7 feet tall and 2 feet wide, silently recessed inward by a fraction of an inch, then slid laterally. There was no mechanical whir, no click of a latch. The acoustic dampening Elias had noticed in the void above was perfectly integrated below. From the dark slit in the architecture, a figure emerged. The assassin did not step into the room. They flowed into it, clad entirely in a light-absorbing matte black polymer suit that left no skin exposed. The intruder looked less like a human and more like a tear in the fabric of reality. The suit was textured, likely laced with the same radar-absorbent materials used in stealth aircraft, rendering them a living void against the rich woods and warm lights of the executive suite. Julian clamped a hand over his own mouth, a muffled whimper escaping his throat. Elias grabbed Julian's shoulder, squeezing hard, a silent command to hold it together. Down in the office, Arthur Sterling reached for his glass, his eyes still fixed on his tablet. The assassin moved with terrifying efficiency. They did not draw a gun. They did not pull a blade. Instead, they utilized the room itself. Reaching to a concealed node on their wrist, the assassin interfaced with the building's localized systems. Suddenly, the heavy, soundproof doors to Sterling's office engaged their deadbolts with a heavy, magnetic thunk. Sterling's head snapped up. Before he could process the locked door, the lights in the office flickered and dimmed to a low, emergency amber. Sterling stood, opening his mouth to call out, but the assassin was already in motion. Stepping into the blind spot created by the towering leather chair, the figure raised a slender pneumatic cylinder. Thwip! The sound was less than a whisper, drowned out by the thunder outside. Sterling stiffened. His hand flew to the side of his neck. He took one staggering step toward the desk, his mouth opening in a silent scream. His eyes bulged, the veins in his forehead pressing against his skin as whatever neurotoxin had been delivered immediately paralyzed his respiratory system. He didn't fall clumsily. As Sterling's knees buckled, the assassin caught him, easing the heavy executive down into his own chair with a macabre gentleness. From the void above, Elias, Maya, and Julian watched in frozen, breathless terror. Their terrifying theory, the obsession that had driven Elias to the brink of professional ruin, was unfolding right before their eyes. The phantom blueprints weren't just a means of corporate espionage. They were an infrastructure for untouchable, invisible murder. The city's elite had constructed a network of lethal arteries right under the noses of the public, turning the skyline into a weapon. The assassin went to work staging the scene. They retrieved the microdart from Sterling's neck with a pair of specialized tweezers, stowing it in a sealed vial. They carefully positioned Sterling's head so it rested on his chest, one hand draped over the armrest, the other resting near the scattered papers on his desk. To the untrained eye, to the coroner who would arrive tomorrow morning, it would look exactly like a massive, sudden myocardial infarction brought on by the stress of a corporate takeover. "My God!" Julian mouthed, tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. "We built them a slaughterhouse." Down below, the assassin paused. The figure froze, standing perfectly still in the center of the room. Slowly, deliberately, the assassin's head tilted upward. The featureless, obsidian visor of the assassin's mask seemed to stare directly through the acoustic ceiling tiles, directly at the louvered grate where Maya's camera was hidden. Elias's heart stopped. Maya instantly killed the power to her wrist monitor, plunging them into absolute darkness, save for the faint ambient light filtering through the grate. Neither of the three dared to breathe. The dust in the air suddenly felt like crushed glass in Elias's lungs. He could hear the frantic, rabbit-fast thudding of Julian's pulse. Seconds stretched into eternity. The vibration of the building, the howling of the wind, the drumming of the rain. It all faded behind the deafening roar of Elias's own adrenaline. If the assassin knew they were up here, there was no escape. They were trapped in a steel coffin, completely stripped of mobility. A flash of lightning illuminated the sky outside, casting a brief, blinding glare through the grate. In that split second, Elias saw the office below. It was empty. Sterling sat dead in his chair. The seamless mahogany wall was perfectly flush, unbroken, restored to its architectural perfection. The ghost had vanished back into the machine. Maya let out a breath that was half sob, half curse. She didn't turn her screen back on. "They're gone," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and absolute dread. "Back into the walls." Julian slumped against the cold I-beam, burying his face in his hands. "They can go anywhere," he cried softly. "Any building, any room. We aren't safe. Nobody is safe." Elias stared down through the grate at the dead man below. The cold reality of their situation settled over him like a shroud of lead. Julian was right. The walls were hollow, but they were far from empty. "We have the proof," Elias said, his voice hardening, stripping away the fear and leaving only a dangerous, razor-sharp resolve. "We know how they do it. Now we find out who controls the blueprints. Let's move." Before they realized the walls have eyes. The silence did not fall. It slammed into them like a physical weight. Deep within the interstitial void of the Academy's hollow walls, the ceaseless, vibrating hum of the central servers died abruptly. The sudden absence of sound was more terrifying than any siren. Elias Thorne froze, his fingers still wrapped tightly around the brass cylinder that housed the stolen vellum of the phantom blueprints. Beside him, Maya Lin and Julian Vance went utterly rigid, their breathing shallow, suspended in the dark. Then came the mechanical cascade. It started below them, a heavy, rhythmic thudding that echoed up through the labyrinth of iron girders and century-old brickwork. Clack, clack, clack. The heavy steel bulkheads of the outer corridors were sliding shut. "Lockdown," Julian whispered, the word barely a ghost of breath in the dust-choked air. His usually aristocratic features, typically arranged in a mask of effortless confidence, were taut, smeared with grease and soot. "They know we're in the walls. They know we have it." "Not just lockdown," Maya corrected, her dark eyes tracking the slivers of light that bled through the ventilation slats of the adjacent faculty wing. The normally warm, incandescent glow of the hallways snapped out, replaced instantly by the bruised, arterial crimson of emergency lighting. The red beams cut through the gloom of their hiding place, illuminating the swirling galaxies of disturbed dust. "Purge protocol." Elias unrolled a section of the ancient blueprint, holding a small, shielded penlight between his teeth. The schematic was maddeningly complex, a layered architectural impossibility that superimposed secret transit arteries over the building's known floor plans. He traced a line with a grease-stained thumb. "If they've initiated a purge, they aren't sending campus security. They're sending the cleaners." As if summoned by his words, the first sound of the hunters reached them. It was not the heavy, authoritative tramping of guards. It was the soft, terrifyingly synchronized whisper of rubber-soled boots on polished marble. It was the faint, electronic chime of night vision optics engaging. It was the subtle scrape of suppressed muzzles sweeping corners. The masterminds had unleashed the hounds. "We need to move," Maya said. She was already adjusting the strap of her canvas pack, her muscles coiled with kinetic potential. "If they have thermal imaging, this plaster won't hide our heat signatures for long." "Up," Elias commanded, his mind racing through the three-dimensional puzzle of the blueprints. "Through the maintenance shaft behind the grand staircase. It leads to the climate control junction. There's a web of high-pressure steam pipes there. It'll wash out their thermals. We'll be invisible. Or boiled alive," Julian muttered, though he was already wedging his shoulder into the narrow gap between two colossal oak studs. "Lead the way, architect." The hollow walls were not empty space. They were a treacherous, vertical jungle of structural bracing, exposed wiring, and ancient, crumbling masonry. Elias moved first, navigating the perilous path with a desperate, practiced grace. They were walking on the spine of the building, balancing on narrow wooden joists suspended over plunging, lightless drops. the very impossible voids they had discovered just days ago. A single misstep would mean a 4-story fall into the foundation's concrete teeth. Behind them, the hunters breached the wall space. The sound of a heavy pry bar splintering the antique wainscoting of the corridor below drifted up to them, followed by the distinctive metallic shuck of a tactical shotgun chambering around. Through the floorboards, an emerald laser sight sliced upward, painting a neon green line across Maya's cheek. She didn't flinch, merely flattened herself against a cold iron wastewater pipe until the beam swept past. There inside the superstructure, Julian breathed, his knuckles white as he gripped a rusted rebar rung. 3 of them, maybe 4. Keep moving, Elias urged softly. 30 yards to the steam junction. They ascended in agonizing silence. The air grew perceptibly hotter, thick with the scent of ozone, oxidized metal, and the damp, earthy smell of century-old undisturbed dark. Sweat stung Elias's eyes, but he dared not wipe it away, his hands fully occupied with maintaining his grip on the treacherous vertical climb. Suddenly, a voice echoed through the hollows, amplified, distorted, synthetic. It was a localized acoustic projection, designed to disorient. "We know you're in the walls, students." The voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the brickwork in overlapping waves. "There is only one exit from the eastern quadrant. Put the cylinder down. Walk out. We will make it quick." Julian let out a dark, breathless chuckle. "Customer service is really going downhill." "Don't speak," Maya hissed. "Directional microphones. They're listening for our heartbeats." They reached the climate control junction just as the pursuit intensified. The space was a massive, cavernous alcove tucked between the 5th and 6th floors, dominated by 3 colossal, asbestos-wrapped steam pipes that throbbed with immense pressure. The heat was instantly suffocating, a wet, heavy blanket that settled over their lungs. "Perfect," Elias gasped, wiping his brow. "Our thermal bloom is masked. The ambient temperature here is over 100 degrees. We blend in." "Yeah, but so do they," Maya pointed out, her eyes scanning the shadows below. A faint click echoed beneath them, the scrape of metal against stone. One of the assassins had climbed the main elevator cabling and bypassed the lower floors entirely. A figure emerged from the gloom below, clad in matte black tactical gear, a multi-lensed panoramic night vision rig strapped to his helmet. He moved with the fluid, predatory grace of a panther. A suppressed submachine gun swept tightly against his shoulder. He was pulling himself up onto the steel grating of the junction level. Elias, Maya, and Julian pressed themselves into the narrow alcove behind the largest steam pipe, their backs against the searing brick. The assassin stepped onto the grating. Clang, clang. The soft footfalls were agonizingly deliberate. The hunter paused, his multi-lensed optics panning the sweltering chamber. He couldn't see their heat, but he was looking for displacement, for the shift of shadows. Julian's boot shifted. It was a fraction of an inch, a tiny adjustment against a loose bolt on the grating, but in the echoing chamber it sounded like a gunshot. The assassin snapped toward the sound, the muzzle of his weapon rising instantly. In that microsecond, Maya's tactical brilliance eclipsed her fear. She didn't retreat. She weaponized the architecture. Reaching up, she grabbed the heavy, cast-iron wheel of a manual pressure release valve jutting from the primary steam pipe. With a vicious, full-body twist, she wrenched it counterclockwise. The pipe screamed. A localized jet of superheated, high-pressure steam erupted directly into the assassin's path. The blast was deafening, a roaring hiss that completely drowned out the sharp, suppressed pft of the killer's weapon discharging wildly into the ceiling. The steam struck the assassin's tactical rig, instantly blinding his thermal and night vision optics in a blinding wash of white-hot fog. The man staggered back, crying out as the blistering vapor penetrated his combat mask. "Now!" Elias shouted over the roar of the venting steam. Julian didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the low railing, utilizing his momentum. He didn't engage the blinded assassin directly. Instead, he swung his heavy steel flashlight in a vicious arc, smashing it into the rusted hinge of the secondary grating beneath the killer's feet. The century-old metal, already weakened by time and moisture, gave way with a sickening shriek. The floor beneath the assassin collapsed. With a muffled shout, the hunter fell backward into the dark void of the maintenance shaft, his body crashing through the wooden baffling below until the sounds abruptly ceased. Maya quickly wrenched the valve shut. The roaring steam abruptly ceased, leaving the three of them gasping in the sudden, ringing silence of the sweltering chamber. One down, Julian breathed, his chest heaving as he stared into the blackness where the assassin had fallen.
Jesus!
That was close. Too close, Maya said, her voice shaking slightly despite her iron composure. She looked at Elias. They're too fast. We can't play cat and mouse in here forever. They'll just flood the walls with gas next. Elias was staring at the blueprints again, the penlight illuminating the complex geometry of the Academy's hidden skeleton. He traced the path the assassins had taken, then traced the remaining egress routes. His blood ran suddenly cold, chilling him despite the oppressive heat of the boiler junction. Elias, Maya asked, stepping closer. What is it? We've been looking at this wrong, Elias murmured, horror dawning in his voice. The purge protocol, the directional microphones, the way that assassin bypassed the lower floors to cut us off. He looked up, his eyes meeting Maya's, then Julian's. They aren't just hunting us. They're hurting us. Hurting us where? Julian demanded. Elias pointed a trembling finger at the apex of the blueprint, where the labyrinth of the hollow walls converged into a single, massive chamber at the very crown of the Academy's vaulted roof, a space designated only as the observatory. Up, Elias said quietly. They've sealed every downward exit. They're forcing us to the roof. The masterminds aren't sitting in a control room, watching us on cameras. He rolled the brass cylinder tight, the finality of their situation settling over them like a shroud. They're waiting for us at the top. The air inside the Apex Tower's central nerve center tasted of ozone, chilled copper, and impending ruin. Hidden within the impossible void, the phantom three-story gap Elias had discovered sandwiched between the 44th and 45th floors. The server room was a humming cathedral of glass and steel. Outside, the midnight storm continued its violent assault on the skyline, rain lashing against the reinforced panoramic windows in sheets of liquid silver. Inside, the only sounds were the frantic, machine gun clatter of Maya Lin's fingers across a glowing mechanical keyboard and the deep, resonant groans of the skyscrapers swaying in the gale. Elias Thorne stood beside her, his eyes locked on the illuminated drafting table that dominated the center of the room. Sprawled across its backlit surface were the stolen physical blueprints, the true schematics of the Apex Tower. They were heavily annotated in red ink, a sprawling, bloody map detailing the hollow walls, the trapdoors, the soundproofed execution chambers, and the ventilation shafts that doubled as corpse chutes. It was an architectural masterpiece weaponized into a slaughterhouse. I'm through the outer firewall, Maya said, her voice tight, barely rising above the roar of the cooling fans. The harsh blue light of the monitors washed over her pale features, highlighting the sheer exhaustion carved into her face. But Vance wasn't bluffing. The core mainframe is segmented. He's got an analog failsafe built into the architecture itself. If I try to trigger the building-wide lockdown remotely, the system will sever the connection and vent the servers. Elias leaned over the table, his eyes tracing the elegant, lethal geometry of Julian Vance's design. He saw the world in lines, in load-bearing columns and tension cables. Vance had designed this building to be a living, breathing predator, but every predator had a heart, and every machine had a master switch. It's not in the code, Maya, Elias murmured, his deep voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. It's in the bones. Vance is a purist. He wouldn't trust a digital firewall with his life. Elias's fingers went to his chest pocket, retrieving his vintage rot-ring drafting pen. The heavy brass barrel was cold, the knurled grip familiar and grounding. It was a tool of creation, but tonight, it would be the instrument of Vance's unmaking. He moved away from the digital consoles and approached a massive, brutalist concrete pillar in the corner of the room. To the untrained eye, it was a structural necessity. To an architect who had spent the last 5 days surviving the rain-slicked labyrinth of the building's guts, it was a glaring anomaly. The load-bearing math didn't add up. Elias ran his fingertips along the cold, porous surface of the concrete until he felt a hairline seam, nearly invisible in the dim light. He pressed his palm flat against the panel and pushed. A heavy, pneumatic hiss echoed through the chamber as the false concrete slid aside, revealing a complex junction box of hydraulic valves, heavy-gauge copper wiring, and a massive mechanical breaker. "There," Elias said. "The analog override." He hardwired the lockdown protocols into the pneumatic system. Suddenly, the overhead intercom crackled to life. "Elias," Julian Vance's voice bled through the speakers, smooth as polished marble but vibrating with a newly born tremor of rage. "I must admit your tenacity is admirable, but you are a draftsman, not a god. You cannot redraw reality." On the primary security monitor, a grid of live feeds flickered. Vance and his team of elite killers, men and women dressed in tactical black, armed with suppressed submachine guns and thermal optics, were moving through the 43rd floor. They were navigating the hidden corridors, moving like ghosts through the hollow walls, ascending toward the impossible void. "They're 2 minutes out," Maya warned, her eyes darting between Elias and the monitors. "If they breach that door, we're dead. Can you trip the breaker?" Elias stared into the junction box. The primary actuator was secured by a magnetic lock, requiring a specialized dual-pronged key to bridge the circuit. He didn't have the key. "I don't need to redraw reality, Julian," Elias said aloud, knowing the room's microphones would carry his voice to the architect of this nightmare. "I just need to erase yours." Elias gripped his brass drafting pen. He unscrewed the cap, exposing the fine tungsten tip, and looked at the heavy, conductive metal barrel. It was the exact diameter of the missing actuator key. "Maya," Elias called out, not looking back. "When I bridge this connection, the pneumatic system will violently depressurize. It's going to hand you master control of the physical security doors. I need you to isolate them. Every killer in those hollow walls, every assassin in the vents. Box them in." "What about the data?" she asked, her hands hovering over the enter key. "Broadcast it," Elias said, his eyes narrowing. "All of it. The bloody blueprints, the heat signatures of the bodies in the foundation, the syndicate's financial ledgers. Send it to the FBI, Interpol, the New York Times, and every open-source data dump on the planet. Let the world see what Julian Vance really builds. Elias, that breaker is carrying industrial current. If you use that pen, do it," Elias commanded. He gripped the brass pen, wrapped his hand in the thick fabric of his jacket to insulate himself, and jammed the heavy metal barrel into the actuator slot, bridging the 2 exposed copper terminals. A shower of blinding blue sparks erupted from the box. The drafting pen grew instantly, searingly hot, the metal hissing as the current surged through it. Elias ground his teeth, leaning his entire body weight against the pen, forcing the actuator into the lock position. The apex tower groaned. It was a sound of profound, mechanical agony. Beneath their feet, the hydraulic systems engaged with a concussive thud that shook the dust from the ceiling. Across the 43rd and 44th floors, thick, reinforced steel blast doors, designed to protect Vance's operation from a military raid, slammed shut with terrifying speed. On the security monitors, the ballet of the elite killers turned into a frantic, chaotic scramble. Maya's fingers danced across the keyboard, translating Elias's mechanical override into a symphony of imprisonment. "Section 4 sealed," Maya called out, her voice rising in triumph over the roar of the building. On screen, 3 killers were abruptly trapped in a narrow, rain-slicked maintenance corridor, the steel doors sealing them in a claustrophobic box. "Ventilation shafts locked," she continued. 2 more assassins, crawling through the ductwork Elias had navigated days ago, were suddenly trapped as heavy titanium louvers snapped shut on both ends of the shafts. Vance was isolated. The cameras showed the mastermind standing alone in a lavish, wood-paneled hallway just outside the entrance to the void. His usual aristocratic composure was entirely shattered. He slammed his fists against a reinforced steel bulkhead that had just dropped from the ceiling, effectively sealing him inside a 10 by 10-foot windowless cube. He was entombed in his own hollow walls. "The physical lockdown is complete," Maya shouted, the glow of the monitors reflecting in her wide, exhilarated eyes. "Elias, let go!" Elias yanked his hand back. The brass drafting pen, now warped, blackened, and partially melted, remained fused to the actuator. The circuit was permanently closed. The maze was locked. "Uploading the blueprints," Maya announced. She slammed the enter key with absolute finality. On the massive digital map projected on the glass wall, a progress bar flashed. A torrent of encrypted data, the terrible, bloody truth of the Apex Tower, surged outward through the fiber optic cables. Terabytes of video evidence, architectural plans detailing the murder rooms, and the exact coordinates of the victims encased in the concrete foundation flooded the global network. It was a masterstroke of exposure. Within seconds, the dark web and the surface web alike were drowning in the evidence of Vance's empire of blood. The intercom crackled one last time. Vance's voice was no longer smooth. It was ragged, breathless, and tinged with the primal panic of a rat caught in a trap. "Elias, you can't do this. The authorities will tear this building apart. They'll tear my legacy apart." Elias walked over to the console, picking up the microphone. He looked at the live feed of Vance, pacing like a caged animal in the sterile, steel-walled corridor. "A building is only as strong as its foundation, Julian," Elias said, his voice cold and echoing through the trapped corridors of the skyscraper. "Yours was built on corpses. I'm just letting gravity do the rest." Elias cut the feed. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the servers and the distant, muffled wails of the police sirens beginning to converge on the streets far below. The flashing red and blue lights painted the rain-streaked windows in a chaotic, beautiful strobe. Maya slumped back in her chair, blowing a stray strand of hair out of her face. She looked at Elias, a tired but genuine smile breaking through the grime and exhaustion on her face. "We did it. They're trapped in their own maze, and the whole world has the map." "Yeah?" Elias breathed, feeling the deep ache in his muscles, the bruises from the labyrinth finally asserting themselves. He looked back at the melted drafting pen, fused forever into the bones of the building. It was a fitting sacrifice. "Come on," Elias said, turning toward the shadows at the back of the server room. He had memorized the original, uncorrupted blueprints years ago. He knew the building's true escape routes, the ones Vance hadn't bothered to alter. "There's a maintenance egress behind the cooling towers. It leads straight down to the subway tunnels." Maya grabbed her encrypted drive, leaving the glowing screens behind. Together, they walked past the illuminated drafting table, leaving the bloody blueprints behind for the FBI. They slipped into the dark, narrow egress, leaving the phantom void, the hollow walls, and the trapped architects of death to face the incoming storm. As the heavy door clicked shut behind them, Elias Thorne smiled in the dark. The blueprints were no longer a secret. They were a reckoning.